Hey everybody, welcome back to another one. This time we're going to be talking about the Americas in the Age of Independence, specifically this sort of long 19th century, how the United States, Latin American countries, the Caribbean evolved kind of along their own paths and their own trajectories, deeply influenced by Europe, but also somehow sort of separate. So this long 19th century we typically describe as, the 1800s plus or minus a little bit, basically everything up to before kind of World War I. States in the Western Hemisphere are going to evolve kind of along their own paths, kind of in their own way. And this is in part because they didn't have necessarily the long sort of imagined histories of places in Europe or Asia or Africa. They were founded as new, sort of as their own entities. And so they sought to create prosperous societies with their own sort of historical narratives of the past and their own understanding of what a nation state was or what the world should look like. That was really, really novel, not only to the time, but sort of still today in some ways. So first, we'll sort of talk about the American nations, the sort of big main players. Then we'll talk about some of the wars and revolutions during the 19th century that shaped these places. And we'll talk about the broader social transformations that have their own unique flavor and character in the Americas, that I think you might be kind of familiar with, but it's good to sort of expand on these. So during this long 19th century, a number of new nation states take shape fully within the Americas. These are places that started to develop with the Atlantic revolutions, but over time change. Remember, we talked about the nation state. It's sort of, there's no blank spots left on the map. Nothing like that is allowed. And so as these territories expanded and solidified, what the sort of shape of the Americas was develops. It wasn't natural, remember, it wasn't all at once, but now there's a pretty standard set of things that we might think about. So you might think about, for example, Canada, and much like the story of the United States, Canada is going to spread from east to west, from these old territories that were British and French kind of combined. So you get a sense from this graph how this is working. Some of the main lands that were sort of occupied before the 19th century, and then sort of slowly expanding out north and west, because a lot of this territory was heavily wooded, very cold in the winter, not necessarily suited for heavy industry or agriculture at this time period, but just so you have a general sense of where this is. And if you look particularly in these areas, here I'll highlight them for you, coming down the Hudson Bay, through the Great Lakes region, sort of these areas were the main sort of initial Canadian sort of strongholds or areas where the state sort of developed and then expands out. It's still where all the biggest cities are in Canada, right, and these sort of things. Another one that you're probably pretty familiar with is the United States. Again, starting relatively small, those 13 colonies on the East Coast, then kind of including Florida and the Midwest, then the Louisiana Purchase, right, which we looked at and was sort of tied to the Haitian Revolution, then continuing to push further west, getting those Northwest territories from the British, or taking Mexican territories from the Spanish Empire or from Mexico, and eventually developing into the sort of shape that we're familiar with now, right? So Latin America probably has a different shape than maybe you're familiar with if you're looking at this. There's some really big states. Not everything had sort of shaken out yet the time we're looking at. So you see Mexico, right, is kind of more or less the shape it is today. A lot of sort of smaller Central American countries, but there's this big Republic of Colombia, right, that's around for a little while when the Spanish Empire is sort of dissolving. Not everything is the same shape it is now. You have places like Argentina that are developing, the extent of Brazil is not fully developed. So all of these nation states are kind of solidifying over the 20th century, or 19th and 20th century, sort of taking the shape that they are now, and do continue to change a little bit. But the story in Latin America is obviously going to be a little bit different, and this stems back to our earlier observation that in sort of Central and South America is primarily colonized by the Spanish and Portuguese, whereas North America is primarily colonized by other waves of British immigration, Dutch, English, Irish, and then Central and Southern European as well. So the shape is going to be a little bit different. But I think overall you guys are pretty familiar with the sort of layout of the Americas. One sort of characteristic that all of these nations share is they're all based on settler colonialism. So nation states in the Americas had to sort of expand into new territories, and the people that were there, that were doing the expanding, founding the nation states, were primarily of European origin. So unlike in France, where you could say there's this French nation and it's real and it's always been here, you can't do that with Mexico or the United States or Brazil, because the whole idea of the nation as it's set up is new and outside. So if you say, well, the United States is real and it's always been here, you kind of have to explain then, well, how did those white people get here? Well, they came from Europe and stuff like that. And the people that were here were like, yeah, they tried to kill all of them and they took their land and stuff like this. So the idea that it's like Americans like developed in America doesn't really work. But in China, for example, you can say, well, there's always been Chinese people here, they developed here, this is Chinese. So settler colonialism is kind of interesting in the way it works. The idea is there's land, new people are going to come onto it. If there happen to be people there, you got to get rid of them, right? So in this painting, it's very romantic, just depicting, the Oregon Trail maybe, or westward expansion. But what's often left out of these paintings is that there were already people there. Often these people were killed or driven further west or assimilated in some kind of strange fashion or put on reservations or whatever. And you sort of get these really ugly situations where there's a sort of contested argument for who has the right to exist within those spaces. And in the case of settler colonialism, it's the settlers who argue they have the right to exist and the right to the land, and the people that are there don't. And this is almost always termed progress or independence or innovation, right? These settlers brought civilization. They brought the modern world. That's the way people talk about it, to justify some of these actions or to justify the expansion. Oh, well, those people weren't really using the land. Well, then why did you have to kill them or kick them out, right? So it's really problematic. But it's also tied to this idea that everything within the nation belongs to the people of that nation, right? These new sort of ideas about nationalism. It's often depicted as really romantic, a Little House on the Prairie and stuff like that. But there's also incredibly vicious undertones. You see legacies of it sort of all over. So around Georgia, all you have to do is look at the name of a river, right? And it's clearly not an English word in most cases. Chattahoochee, right? That doesn't even sound like an English word. Well, what is that stuff? Well, it's left over from names that were English approximations of the spoken language of the people that used to be there. Well, what happened to those people? Well, they had to go, right? Because you had to make way for new settlers, essentially. And so you see this sort of carved out, these spaces of names and memory that reflect the sort of previous people that lived there. But it's very strange. Why keep those? Why not make them all English words? Most of the states, right, are named after Native Americans. If you haven't thought about this in the United States, like Dakota, right, was names of Indian groups. Utah, California is a Spanish word. Mississippi, right, describes the language. Massachusetts describes the language. all of these sorts of things. Illinois, right, was a tribal name. So why keep these things? Why not change the names? Why not call them all, Georgetown or whatever? And I think a lot of people would argue uh, it's a sort of could be a little bit like a victory dance, right? Like keeping those things that other people had. Some people say, oh, it sounds exotic, right? That could be true. Some people might argue that that's just the name that those things were before, and so it's hard to sort of rename them. But all of these things show the sort of memory, the sort of legacy of these places and how they used to be someone else's or somewhere else, or housed different peoples. This process of settler colonialism is probably the most intense in the United States, but it happens in Argentina, Canada, Mexico, Brazil. It happens other places as well. And we'll see sort of more of that this time, but also in sort of future lessons as well. So now that you're familiar just with the sort of shape of the places we're talking about during this 19th century, we can start to look at how these states expanded, how they filled out, how they sort of stretched across the continents, and what were the sort of ideological narratives that came about with these nation states, and what sort of conflicts or problems arose as they bumped into each other or as they tried to solidify their borders. In the United States, there is a series of sort of almost one conflict after another for most of the 19th century. The United States is the most sort of militarily aggressive in the Western Hemisphere, and it's hard to sort of pick an era in US history where it wasn't involved in a war of some kind, either domestically or internationally, once the 20th century starts. There's a long ongoing war against Native American people, because remember, under settled colonialism, in order for it to function and to have space for new people to live, you have to get rid of the people that were already there. This is tied into manifest destiny and the idea that the United States owned from sea to shining sea even before we really did. But there's a lot of little stops along the way. So in 1836, for example, Texas declared independence. It was its own little place filled with Tejanos, right, which was the sort of alleged nationality or ethnicity of the people who lived there. I don't know what happened to the Tejanos. I guess they just all became American and such. But there's the Mexican-American War, right, where the United States goes to war with Mexico and basically carves off a bunch of territory. There's the American Civil War that you guys are probably all familiar with, where the North and South kind of come into conflict, basically over whether or not slavery is going to remain a practice in the United States. There's also the Spanish-American War, leading to the United States gaining all kinds of territories in the Caribbean and the Pacific Ocean. So there's a lot of these sorts of ongoing conflicts that shape the dimensions and the sort of character of the United States. We looked at this originally when we talked about the Atlantic revolutions and the sort of American way of war, and how war comes to play a sort of oversized role in the American imagination and sort of everyday life. But here you really see it played out in terms of how it's shaping the state, how it's shaping who belongs in the state, what territories are controlled by the state, and how it came to fill out its current sort of structure. In other places, they didn't necessarily have that. So one of the sort of myths or sort of like idea about Canada is that it expanded and became a state without any war to speak of. So they didn't really have a revolution in the same sense. You can look to the War of 1812, when British forces in Canada repel US troops, and there sort of starts to form this new Canadian identity in much the same way the other Atlantic revolutions kicked off. And people there start to think of themselves as Canadian. They're sort of French, they're sort of British, depending on where they are, but they're something different. Under this system, the Canadian government begins to expand into new territories. By the time they're expanding, a lot of these territories are not necessarily all that full of people. They are sort of afraid that if they don't expand, the United States will. And there's this sort of rush to shore up borders in that the Americans are expanding so quickly to the west and across the continent that the sort of nascent Canadian mind, or the sort of early Canadian government, thought, if we don't establish what it means to be Canadian and where it means to be Canadian, the United States is just going to take all of these things as well. So it's not until 1867 that Canada actually becomes a nation that's independent, and even then it's still sort of one of the Commonwealth countries of Britain. But it is not without any conflict. Remember, just like in the United States, Canada was filled with people. They don't call them Native Americans, they call them First Nations people. It's the same idea, though. And a lot of those people were repressed militarily, or assimilated, or had their children forcibly taken away, or all kinds of things like this, in much the same way as the United States. So there is an element of sort of military repression that comes with the expansion of Canada, but less sort of internal conflict, and certainly less international conflict than the United States. Canada is regionally based, right? So there's provinces rather than a republic of several different states, but a similar idea. And much like the United States, they can't have a sort of national story that stretches back forever, because it's very clear there was a time when Canada didn't exist in terms of nationhood. So it's a very clearly created nation. In Latin America, the conflicts are a little bit different. Other than the United States and Mexico, most Latin American conflicts tend to be in the state rather than sort of shaping the outside borders of the state, or interstate conflict. Also, in Latin America, constitutionalism doesn't work as well, and there's lots of different reasons for this. This might be down to the fact that the Spanish and Portuguese empires simply worked differently than the British and Dutch empires, and thus, when colonies broke away from Spain and Portugal, the things they kept drew them more towards less constitutional forms of government. As we saw, for example, in the case of Brazil, it had nothing to do with real independence or Enlightenment thinking. Prince Pedro just basically wanted to stay and led a sort of Creole rebellion before it could really get off the ground. So a sort of different system evolves. You have much more regional sort of conflict between different military leaders that are seeking to control and channel the power of these states and shape them in the way they really want. This isn't to say that you don't have political leadership that shapes these eras. You certainly do. It's more contested. So we might look at Mexico for an example to get a sense of the sort of interregional conflict and the way these states form. So example might be in 1850s. You have this guy here, President Benito Juarez, who is one of the early Mexican presidents and seeks to reform Mexican government in a way that will give more genuine sort of power to the people and improve the overall quality of life for citizens. Well, in order to do this, he has to ruffle some feathers with Europeans. Remember, the Creole elite wanted more separation from Europe. So France decides on something very funky. They invade Mexico. If you haven't heard the story, there's a brief period where the French army tries to invade Mexico. It's led by Maximilian, right, who's going to try and sort of make the Mexicans come to heel to the whims of the French government. We've already seen that France has lost a lot of sway in its sort of colonial endeavors in the Americas. So this is sort of a economic rather than imperialistic agenda for the French. Nevertheless, it's a complete failure, but it causes all kinds of factionalism within Mexico. So rather than having a general sort of political consensus about what it means to be Mexican or the sort of political structure that Mexico should have, you start to have more and more sort of disparate ideas that can connect to each other in different ways, leading to a sort of second revolution in Mexico. In 1910, you have the Mexican Revolution beginning. It's really complicated and messy. but it sort of demonstrates the early failures or inadequacies of a sort of constitutional state at that level. During that time, the revolution overthrows a new sort of president of Mexico that had become a dictator, Diaz, and you have different sort of competing military and political factors that are struggling over what it means to be Mexican and what a sort of Mexican government is going to look like, rather than in the United States and Canada, where you have definitely competing visions of the direction of those states, but you have a more sort of unified foundation for what the state should look like. This is going to be repeated all over Latin America. When we saw just a second ago that sort of state of Colombia, the Greater Colombia, it doesn't last very long. And it's the same sort of replication of these problems. And it's really tricky as to why this happens. The only thing that might sort of stand out as why this happens is that the early revolutions in Latin America were fairly well all hijacked by those Creole elite. So independence in Latin America in the early sort of first wave of Atlantic revolutions was less aimed at sort of genuine ground up popular support and more aimed at Creoles getting independence from other Europeans, right? So maybe that's one sort of area where this can be explained. So the real story about the Americas in some ways are all the sort of social transformations that take place due to the sort of novelty of the political structures that develop in the Western Hemisphere in a somewhat unique way. All of the sort of problems of the modern world are going to be in the Americas the same way they are in Europe, and then the same way they are going to be in Asia. But there's sort of unique circumstances that, when you account for them, show a different trajectory, a different development in the Americas that lead it into a unique place, we'll sort of see. So the first thing that you might think of in the Americas that's really different than other places is the sort of extreme multiculturalism that develops. So all of the elites in the Western Hemisphere, right up until today, tend to be primarily of European ancestry. Not necessarily European, right? As we looked at like the Creoles, right? We're all born in Mexico or Brazil or Colombia or Argentina, but of European descent. Some people would claim this white, but the problem with that is that white folks in Canada and the United States tend to see these people as brown if they come from Mexico, even though in Mexico those people are seen as white if they're talking to native peoples. So it's really tricky. So the sort of elite is primarily of European ancestry, not actually from the Americas. So this is a little bit more reminiscent of empire. Remember when we talked about empires, they tend to be ruled by a small elite that's different from the majority of people. And in some places we will see this. You also have native peoples. Despite the best efforts of the American government and military, for example, Native American peoples were not wiped out. They were not completely destroyed. There's several million Native Americans in the United States today. There's First Nations in Canada. All over Latin America and Central America, there's large sections of the population that are most closely related to the Maya or the Inca or indigenous people that were there before the arrival of Europeans. Likewise, you have entire populations that were brought willingly or unwillingly to the Americas, such as the slave population from West Africa and Central Africa. Once those people are incorporated into society, that changes the demographic as well, right? We talked about if you go to Caribbean islands today, many of them are primarily populated by people whose ancestors were from West Africa or Brazil, right, which is actually where the majority of enslaved peoples were transported, has huge black populations, things like this. We also know that these people were primarily freed during the 19th century, if not given full civil rights. So Mexico outlaws slavery pretty early on. They're the first to do so in the Americas. after the sort of Haitian Revolution that showed that such things were even possible. But it's not until 1888 that slavery is actually illegal in the Americas. Brazil is the last holdout. Just before them is the United States. And these freed slaves or ex-slaves are going to become every bit as integrated into society as anybody else, even though they'll be denied civil rights in many places for kind of a long time. Also, there's all kinds of immigration. Europeans are coming to the United States and Canada at huge rates during this period, but Asians are coming to the West Coast, to Mexico, to Peru, Chinese and Japanese folks in particular, going to California during the gold rush, going to Mexico at the same time. So here you have a picture of the sort of development of gold mining in California. So California was a former Spanish colony. There's people of Spanish descent there. There's Native Americans there. There's these white Europeans there. There's freedmen that are there. But here you see like a lot of Chinese folks, right, that I'm sure you have heard. This sort of narrative too of Chinese folks coming to be part of the gold rush. So all of these people are mixing and mingling in a way that in other nation states that are developing around the world you don't see. The sort of multicultural aspect of other nation states in Europe or in Asia gets stamped out a little bit earlier. Whereas in the United States and Canada and Mexico, these things are sort of more apparent from their founding. And you can see a lot of these things in the sort of basic history that you've surely been taught about the United States, like the massive immigration coming to the east coast of the United States, or what happens when you try to integrate all of these freed former slave populations in the United States. So you're familiar with these narratives, but it's particular for sure to the sort of Western Hemisphere. So just like there was uneven sort of developments or relationships between these sort of multicultural states or multicultural groups, there's uneven economic development between them as well. So part of this is tied to that same multiculturalism, and we can look at within states. People who were minorities or who were denied rights tended to have less economic development, obviously. You can also look at the exchange between nation states and their previous colonial counterparts. So for example, by the 1840s, British technology and capital is coming to the United States and Canada. British folks are building factories and Americans are utilizing British technology. And there's a sort of interchange there that rapidly leads to the development of these industrial processes in the northern section of the Americas. Whereas in Latin America, the sort of colonial legacy from the Spanish and the Portuguese is less influential. Not only are those states developing slower in Europe in terms of their industrial output and capital, but they have less connections long-term with those regions as well. So despite the sort of horrors of the Revolutionary War between the United States and Britain, they remained kind of closely in contact and actually exchange a lot of money and ideas back and forth. But the prestige of the Spanish and Portuguese Empire has really fallen apart by these times, and so we're in less of a position to help or support or engage in commerce with the sort of southern half of the Americas. And you can see this in all kinds of ways. In North America, for example, railroads and steamships and factories pop up really quickly and widely across the continent, and the economies really industrialize. Whereas in Latin America, you tend to see states having less access to those, turning more towards the development of raw materials, so continuing that plantation economy or continuing export-based economies primarily of raw material rather than finished products. So here you go, this is the pounding of the Golden Spike here, showing the Transcontinental Railroad completed in the United States. A sort of similar project in Latin America wouldn't be completed for quite some time. So a real difference there in terms of development. Similarly, across the Americas, gendered relationships are sort of different than in the Afro-Eurasian context, in that they develop unevenly in the same way we saw like British factories, right, were initially run by, or not run by, but employed female laborers and child laborers, and then those were replaced by men primarily as the sort of breadwinners. In the US, you see similar things happen, or across the Americas, you see similar things happen, but because the nation states were founded in the Americas on those Enlightenment principles and that idea of revolution, those uneven gender relationships sit right next to all kinds of ideas stemming from the Enlightenment that women should have more rights or more power or more representation. So there's kind of a conflict. The legacy of sort of European gender roles and stereotypes mixed with native tradition of empowered women, mixed with Enlightenment ideas that anyone can do anything, kind of all bound together to create a really unique situation. So you start to see, actually really early on comparatively, female activism in the United States and Mexico and Brazil, all over the Americas, culminating in some ways in 1848 in Seneca Falls. Women get together and essentially argue for the first time very publicly that women should have rights, and that any nation that wants to be truly free or engage in these ideas of the Atlantic revolutions or of the Enlightenment have to include women. And of course, these women are humiliated for this, they're treated poorly for this, they're ridiculed. But it really sets in motion this idea that in the sort of new world that was being built in the Americas, it could be one where women had rights. And that wasn't always possible in other contexts. It's not just relegated to white folks or to the United States either. This is seen kind of differently in other places. For example, in Mexico or in a lot of Latin American countries, there's this idea of machismo and sort of masculinity. However, a lot of the revolutionary movements, like the Zapatistas, for example, include lots of women, and particularly among the sort of Creole elite in Latin America, women have sometimes these oversized roles in the sort of revolutionary thinking or revolutionary activities. In the case of Mexico, the actual Mexican Revolution. And they write about it in really interesting ways. For example, here's a little bit of writing from Adela Zamudio in this poem, I guess you would say, To Be Born a Man. So this is the sort of translation for it, which is why it doesn't sound the way it should if you were reading it in Spanish. But if you read it, she basically is making this really strong social critique that men can do whatever they want, and because they're a man, they can get away with it. Whereas women can't do any of this stuff, and if they do, they get punished. So men don't have to work as hard around the house, right? Their husband can just kind of sit around, but who cares because he's a man, right? Or women can't vote, even if they're smart and classy, just because of their sex. But the poorest felon who's a man can vote, stuff like this. And these sorts of things circulate widely around Latin America. There's a sort of tension in these gender relationships because there's less sort of connection between gender and class and race and class than there is in other places, or at least those connections are more sort of tenuous and debatable. So you may notice this one's a little bit short. I didn't want to give you too much stuff. I wanted you to be able to kind of focus on what's coming because for the next class, we're actually going to have the midterm. So if you don't know how the midterm's working yet, make sure you look at the announcement. I'm going to put in there how to access it. You access it very much the same way as you do the quiz, and then you'll see it says midterm, right? It's during our regularly scheduled class time. It's just online, so make sure you look at the announcement if you aren't quite sure how that's happening.